Welcome, everybody. Wave your hand if you can hear me. Anybody? Beautiful. Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate that. I'm gonna let everybody in here. Tom, good to see that you made it.
Yep.
We had a slight technical hiccup when you do these registration Zooms. It sends a different link, so we were actually congregated in a different room from everybody else, but we identified the problem and got over here. So appreciate you all being here.
Yeah, we don't just do real estate, we do technology.
Yeah.
Let's see, are we
And I am going to give John co-host. Do you also need co-host Tom here?
no, I don't need it.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
Not
John,
really. No.
John should be.
You're just going to click on the screen. And then,
There we go.
So do I show up myself and individually here? What's happening? I'm like, they're not gonna see me.
So maybe we do a little bit of introduction and then
Yeah, I'm still letting a couple people in here. They're popping up. What I may do, Tom, just so I don't get distracted because I'm only capable of doing one thing at a time.
yeah.
I just made you co-host, so you should be able to also let people in as they come in. Does that work?
Sure. Yeah, that work.
Beautiful. See if that works. You see Mark coming in?
It's a big responsibility, Paul.
Yeah, it's like playing whack-a-mole. Go let him in. There we go. And the leash is coming in. You see that as well. I just want to make sure you see that.
Yes, I see yep, I get the little blue thing. So
Wait a minute. Okay, beautiful. Yeah. Okay. Well, super. Appreciate your patience and get started here. Appreciate you all being here. Real quick, my name is Paul Frank. I am the president, CEO of the PDF group of companies. I've been a commercial real estate developer and broker for 40 years. Over my career, I've developed and brokered hundreds of millions of square feet of real estate all over the country, all product types, a little bit of international stuff as well. I've also been an athlete and a coach most of my life. That's why you see that Coach Frank there. I coached 25 plus years of sports at the youth, high school, and collegiate level. It's not some title I just threw on there for marketing purposes. Tom Bacon is here. He works with me as well. And he was fortunate enough to get John over here to speak to us today. So Tom, you want to introduce yourself?
sure. I'm Tom Bacon, obviously, and John. I've been doing commercial real estate since 1984. Started in LA and then been in SAC since 1991. But that's not the point of this webinar. John Gorelka is a friend and a fellow Rotarian. He's been very active with the Rotary and doing community service stuff, but he also in his spare time does tax law. He's got a master's in taxation, and he's also a graduate of the McGeorge School of Law and specializes in, as I said, taxation. And I'm just honored to have him on to share his wisdom with all of us. And I think I'll just leave it at that for now. And John, if you can go ahead, you can go ahead and get started with your presentation. If you have anything else to add about yourself, feel free to do so. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the very kind words, Tom. Let me get the slides to advance.
Is everybody seeing that shared screen of John's there?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay.
Well, thank you for being here. As Tom indicated, my name is John Gorelka. I'm the founder of the Gorelka Law Firm. I have 30 years of experience. I'm recognized as a top attorney by tax attorney and estate planning attorney by U.S. News and World Reports. My background is a little bit different. I was an income tax auditor and hearing officer. So what that means is, as bad as the attorney jokes might be, nobody was ever happy to see me when I came to audit them. And also, there are about 190, almost 200,000 lawyers in the state of California. I'm a certified specialist in taxation with the state bar and a certified specialist in estate planning. Fewer than 100 are certified specialists in both, and I'm one of those few. Here we're talking really about property tax planning for the real estate investor. And just noted, I'm identifying some issues that I've seen in my practice, just to try and make sure that people are aware of the planning opportunities that are available. Make sure that things move smoothly. And a lot of this in terms of a little bit of history, and all of this really applies to California properties. Doesn't really apply to properties in other states. California is unique in terms of the way it taxes property. You're all probably familiar with Prop 13. Historically, there used to be a very broad parent-child exclusion, which allowed people to transfer property, particularly their home and then even other real properties, to the next generation without their property tax being increased. In Prop 19, which I believe was 2021, came into effect and made two major changes. It substantially restricted the parent-child exclusion, and it also expanded rules for homeowners, 55 and older, to transfer their property tax base from one to the other. This presentation really focuses on that restriction on the parent-child exclusion, and in particular, it's going to talk about doing that by planning with business entities and generally speaking LLCs, but using business entities to accomplish that result in terms of minimizing the property tax. And failure to plan can have a very, very substantial effect on your ability to transfer wealth and value from your generation to the next. And that's really what the focus is that we're talking about. And as I say, what we lost is that we had a parent-child exclusion that, for the residents really was unlimited in value. And then it also allowed you to transfer the, first million of trended base year value of all other real property. That 1 million is deceiving, because that was actually the 1 million that was on the property tax rolls at that time. So that, as you know, the values of the property can be substantially higher than what you would see in terms of the fair market value. And so here, for example, of what the old rule would be, is mom owns Blackacre and is her principal residence. It's assessed value. The assessed value on the rolls is 3.5 million. The value of it is 8 million. Transfers it to her child or children. No reassessment whatsoever. And once again, when you're looking at property tax rates, they're generally trending between 1 and 1.2%. And it's not often a huge amount in any one year. But the problem is that property tax, you pay that property tax each and every year you own the property until it's sold. And so when you look at the cumulative effect on that, it's very substantial. And so what happened is with the parent-child exclusion, is the transfer of the residence was first limited in value, and then second, so it's now limited to the base year value plus $1 million, and then also the child or children have to actually use that as their principal residence. So backing up a little bit, it had to be the parents' principal residence and had to be the children's principal residence. So it's a very significant restriction on what was there before. And we've lost any type of ability to transfer property other than the principal residence to the next generation without minimizing property tax. And so an example of this is now we have mom also owning a home. The assessed value is $350,000. The fair market value is $1.2 million. When she leaves that to her children, assuming the children actually use it as her principal residence, then the property tax will be reassessed. But if the child or children fail to use it as their principal residence, then the property will be reassessed. So it's a very significant, very, very significant difference. And so really what Prop 19 is a reminder that there are other planning that remains available and unaffected. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on. So why are we here today? And so some years back, Michael Dell and his family, you probably recognize the Dell name if you look at your, some of your computers or whatnot. But Michael Dell and his family bought the Fairmont Miramar Hotel in Santa Monica for $200 million, and the property tax was not reassessed. And so, and the reason why they were able to do that was in part because of the planning that was done by the prior owners or the people that they purchased the property from. That transfer was actually challenged at appeal. And not only did the county lose, but Michael Dell was able to recover their attorney's fees. And so in that case is Ocean Avenue versus County of Los Angeles. And so that's an example of really what we're talking about here. This simple planning can actually have tremendous effects. And if you have an ability to transfer property for somebody else, it creates a greater value when you go to sell it. And here, the way it was done is Michael Dell acquired a 48% interest in the LLC that owned the property. Michael's wife acquired 49% in her separate property trust. And then 2 other insiders joined in that transaction. And again, if you want to see that case, which is interesting to read, it's Ocean Avenue LLC versus County of Los Angeles. So had a tremendous effect. And again, that savings that they're going to have will continue each and every year that they own the property. And so also in 2002, the Gallo family purchased, Louis Martini, which owned 1,000 acres of Napa and Sonoma vineyards. And again, they were able to do that without the property being reassessed. And the property is obviously worth substantially more now. So careful planning is really required to make this happen. So the best result, and it's a simple thing, but it's a huge thing. The best result is not to acquire the property individually, and transfer it into an LLC. And we'll talk about what the effect is. The best result is to acquire the property directly into the LLC. Oftentimes, people may not do that by acquiring the property and then transferring the property in. It actually creates a taint or that applies to the property and minimizes your ability to do planning. Let's say you've acquired property in your name, in your name individually, and you still maybe want to participate in this. You can still transfer it into the LLC and you may be able to avoid this taint. But what you want to do is normally, and we'll go over this a little bit more in detail as we go through this, when you transfer a property into a business entity and the business entity has the same ownership as the person's transferring it in, there is a revenue and taxation code section 6282, which prevents the reassessment of that property. If you ignore that, that exclusion and have the property reassessed, then you'll be able to get around that taint. So again, even if you miss it at the first opportunity, you have an opportunity to do it later. And again, you're going to need to look to see how much time and how much value has increased between the two to see what would be most appropriate for you. But again, it's something that you're going to want to look at and think about before you move carefully. And the definition and for property tax purposes, the definition of a change in ownership is actually different than you're going to see for income tax purposes and otherwise. And there are 3 elements: transfer of a present real property interest, which includes the beneficial use of that property, and the value of that interest is substantially equal to a fee or full ownership. So those are the elements that we need to show for a transfer of ownership, to fall into this category. So if there's direct ownership by the LLC of real property, that really provides the very best estate planning opportunities. And here, there is no change for future transfers of that company interest until one person obtains direct or indirect control of more than 50%. So not only do we want to make sure that we're acquiring the property directly by the LLC or using, if we can, a transfer in that doesn't avoid reassessment. We're going to also, after this, you may want to review your estate plans just to make sure that what you're doing is actually going to still be able to provide for the desired result of avoiding property tax, and in this case, also obtaining basis step up. And I think everyone here knows what basis step up is. I'm sure, but if you don't, if I buy Tom's house for $100,000 and I sell it to Paul for $400,000, then I pay gain of $300,000. But if I'm selling that house not because not because it's mine, but because not because it's Tom's, but because I'm administering Tom's estate and he has passed away, then the basis that $100,000 cost is increased to the fair market value as of the date of death. So when you hear basis step up, really what you want to be thinking about is lower capital gains. And so that's really what we're looking at, with this, is being able to lower capital gains and then also prevent the property tax from being reassessed. And so 64 revenue and taxation code section 64C really provides that a change in ownership, when the property is inside an entity, such as an LLC, occurs when a person obtains direct or indirect control of more than 50%, and that can be ownership of the partnership or capital, and it can also be voting. And so what we want to do is set our estate plans up so that way we're not violating that 50% rule. And so for an example, we have an LLC that's owned 90% by mom and 10% by the son. And the LLC has purchased the property or Blackacre directly. Mom dies and leaves 50% to her son, 50% to the daughter. And because now son has acquired a greater than 50% interest in the property, now the entire property is going to be reassessed. So again, we're going to want to make sure when we go through this that we're thinking about how this is going to work out. Here we have an LLC that's owned 100% by mom. LLC purchased the Blackacre and she leaves 100% of her interest to her only child. Again, that child is acquired more than 50%. So now the entire property is going to be reassessed. And that reassessment is going to continue for as long as the property is owned. And so in a recent trust administration that we had, we have, it's an estate, it's a taxable estate, it's over $30 million. The property was acquired directly by the LLC from the prior owner. It was a $13 million property. It was left 50% to the spouse and 50% to the daughter. This is actually a blended family. So the reason why that's important is really we have two different family chains that may be moving along there. Spouse has other family members that may be leaving her interest to. Daughter has her own children and husband and family. And so here there's no assessment because we were able to maintain that 50% level. And so and both are able to obtain the basis step up for a lower capital gain. And it's not just the lower capital gain, it also provides for greater depreciation deductions if you continue to keep the property. So there's a value to that either way. And so here again, just examples. LLC is owned 90% by mom, 10% by son. LLC again is directly purchased the Blackacre or the property. So again, what we want to do is structure this so that way no one person achieves a greater than 50% interest. And so here we might have 40% going to the daughter, 40% going to the son, and 10% to the daughter-in-law. Because again, the son already owned 10%, or she can just structure it so that way, again, no one person acquires greater than 50%. And it's just something that needs to be thought about. And this is something that I've seen that's often been, just not considered going through, which can have, a very significant effect from a property tax standpoint. And so again, here we have an LLC that's acquired directly from the prior owner. 100% by mom, has only one child. So now what we're doing is we're looking for other beneficiaries or assets or buckets. So mom leaves 50% to son, maybe 50% to daughter-in-law. Maybe so again, we want to make sure we have that in the estate plan, we sometimes we're very concerned about divorce. So we may want to have, may want to have provisions, for an alternate if the daughter-in-law is not married to the son. And then same, or maybe 50% of the son, 50% of the grandchildren. But again, we're looking to try and establish a structure. So no more than 50% of an interest in the LLC goes to any one person, which prevents that reassessment. So now this is the taint that I was talking about. And the taint really is where the property is first acquired by an individual and then it's transferred to a legal entity. And backing up a little bit, we want to be cautious about how we do that, how we think that through. We may want to trigger reassessment if the value isn't too different. If for example, if we identify this very quickly after the property is purchased, then we're not going to have that much of a increase in the property tax. So we're going to want to look at that. But the biggest thing is you don't want to have surprises, and it's very easy to have a surprise with this. And so, if it is transferred to someone and no more than the 50% is transferred, then we're going to be safe. But then also, and this is what triggers the taint. If an individual acquires the property individually and then transfers it into a business entity, and so if the business entity has the same ownership as the individual, so it could be 2 people, 3 people, so long as everything is proportional, then there's no reassessment. And so that prevents a reassessment at the time the property is transferred, but then that creates a taint. And you can cure the taint, and I'll go through that. But doing that, makes it, it prevents the ability really to get the property, the basis step up, which is a huge loss with respect to that. So here, husband and wife, for example, and if you're not wishing to transfer property, you're not wishing to trigger a reassessment, you're going to want to have something so that way it's proportional. So that way, again, you're not surprised. And so here husband and wife own Blackacre as community property. And so for asset protection and maybe from tax planning purposes, they put that into a family limited partnership, and they transfer 99% of husband and wife's community property interest. And then the daughter has a 1% interest, or an entity that's owned by daughter has a 1% interest. Because there's even that 1% interest that's off, the entire property is going to be reassessed. And so that's going to be a surprise if that's not planned for. So again, here a spousal transfer where husband and wife transmute Blackacre into community property. Husband and wife transfer Blackacre into an LLC. It's owned 50-50 by husband and wife. There's no change in ownership. So at least at the time of the first transfer, there is no reassessment of the property. And so people are at least maybe happy at that point, but they may not understand they may not understand the taint that's gonna follow. And then the other thing that you need to be very careful of when you're doing this is if the property is covered by a mortgage, then you're technically going to need lender consent. And quite frankly, if there's a mortgage and there's a deed of trust on the property, then there's certainly never going to be the transfer that you're going to do into that entity is not going to make it more difficult for the lender to foreclose. They'll still be able to do that, but the transfer will almost certainly violate the provisions of the deed of trust, which can trigger a default, which can trigger the lender taking action. So you're going to always want to get lender consent for that. One way you might be able to get around, one way that you may be able to get around lender consent if you're transferring just for the basis step up is using a long-term lease that's long enough to trigger ownership change for income tax purposes, but not longer than the 25 years that would trigger a property tax change. But again, we're going to want to make sure that we get lender consent along the way. I don't think most lenders are really sitting and watching and I have had clients willing to take that risk. But I've also, in my experience, I have not had too many lenders that have withheld consent. But what you want to make sure that you have something in place, especially if you have a favorable interest rate on a loan, it may give a lender an ability to attack that. And so, we're always going to want to make sure that we get lender consent along the way. And so what is this taint that I'm talking about? And so, so what happens now is the same rule applies as before. If there is a change so that any one person acquires more than 50% interest in the property, then there's a change in ownership. But if the property has been transferred into an entity such as an LLC, and if that transfer that went into that LLC was not subject to reassessment under that 62A2 I referred to above, then what happens, there's a second rule. And what that second rule is, if there's a change in more than 50% of the original co-owner's interest in the property cumulatively over time, then it's treated as a transfer of the property triggering reassessment. And so that's a substantial restriction on what's happening before, and it makes it very difficult to get property from one generation to the next, because when the parent dies, you're going to have, you're almost always going to have that 50% reassessment. And we'll go over how to avoid that or how to protect for that in a moment. But again, an example of what that taint is an LLC is owned 25% by husband, 25% by wife, 25% by daughter, 25% by son. Husband dies, transfers 25% to wife. No change in ownership because not more than 50% of the original co-owners. And in this case, the original co-owners are husband, wife, daughter, and son. So that protects you. Also, the other important point is interspousal transfers don't typically count towards the 50%. But again, we're going to want to be conscious of this each and every step along the way. So that way we don't have a surprise that's going to trigger cost to the family. Here, husband and wife own Blackacre, and they transfer it to an LLC. So they owned it individually. They've transferred it to an LLC. LLC is owned 50% by husband, 50% by wife. And husband dies, transfers 50% to son. And then there's no to son. Actually transfers 50% to is 50%, 25% to son, 25% to daughter. Wife now transfers a small percentage, in this case 5%. Once we've transferred more than 50% of the original co-owners, then the entire property is going to be reassessed. And so again, that's triggering a significant increase in tax that's going to continue for as long as they own the property. Here, husband owns the LLC's owned husband 50%, wife 50%, and husband transfers 50% to the son, 25% to the daughter. Son transfers 25% to a friend. Again, we haven't gone over that 50% cumulative transfer, so we're okay. But at some point in time, when when wife dies, that's certainly going to happen. And so again, that makes it almost impossible to achieve the same result that we're getting with the direct acquisition of the property by the LLC. Another example, and I'm going through these just to sort of give an idea of what can and can't be done. LLC is owned by 50% by husband, son 1, 20%, son 2, 20%, daughter 10%. Husband dies, transfers 5% to son, 5% to each of the sons, 40% to the daughter. There's no change in ownership, at least at this point, because not more than 50% of the original co-owner's interest has been transferred. So again, some planning for doing that. But again, at some point in time, when there's another transfer of an interest, you're going to trigger a change in ownership. And that transfer could be as small as a 0.1%. So again, there's a very significant difference in terms of the planning opportunities that are available. And again, to possibly avoid the taint, if you've acquired it individually, maybe consider and look at the difference. Maybe we just transfer it into the LLC, but don't claim the proportional interest exemption if that's not too substantial. And if we do that, then we can get ourselves into the same position as if the company directly acquired the property. And so again, it's a planning interest that should be considered each and every step along the way. The other issue with respect to this is there's a reporting requirement. If there's a change in ownership under either the first rule or the second rule, you actually have to report that to the county within 90 days. And oftentimes, if somebody's doing a trust administration, they may not even know of the existence of the asset or the LLC within that 90-day period. So it's a trap, and it can trigger a penalty, which includes a percentage of the property tax increase in the base year from the base year, which can be very substantial. And so one of the things that you might want to consider, and this is also helpful if you have somebody who has a taxable estate and they're trying to get the property to the next generation to avoid estate tax, but we don't want the property tax to be reassessed. And so we're operating in a little bit of a gray area. But what we can do, and again, the property passes directly to an LLC, no children, no assessment. Once in the children, the parents can transfer 49% of their interest in the children. We would to the children, and because it's below that 50% under either rule, there's not going to be any reassessment. We're going to want to file a gift tax return. And then some period of time later, we're going to want to terminate the LLC and transfer the property out of the LLC back down, 51% to the kids, 49% to the children. And again, there's no reassessment because it's coming out based on the same ownership. And then at this point, the parents, again, we want to have a little bit of time between each step. The parents can give 2% of their interest to the children, and that 2% would be reassessed. So now we have a reassessment of 2% of the value of the property. That will result in an increase, but it's significantly less than 100% increase for sure. And so now we're going to want to form a new LLC with the parents owning the remaining. Actually, that should be 49%. And once again, now the parents may choose to transfer that 49% to the children. We haven't transferred more than 50%. And so now we're going to be able to get that transfer. There's going to be no reassessment. Children can create their own interest to pass it on to their grandchildren. But we need to consider what's something that's called the step transaction doctrine, where government entities can use that to try and combine those and say that the real intent was to transfer the properties to avoid property tax. But again, this is something that can be helpful, especially if you have somebody who has a taxable estate, because we're trying to get the property down to the next generation outside of the estate for estate tax purposes, but still retain the same property tax base and preventing the reassessment. And here we're able to transfer that with only a 2% reassessment. So, and again, we're going to want to use a gift tax return. Income must be reported properly. If we're transferring property from the parents to the kids, or maybe we want to have some rent to show that there was a true transfer that's being paid, unless it's the residence or is being used. But the problem here is you're losing the basis step up. So it's helpful for somebody who's trying to avoid estate tax, because we're able to get it out of their taxable estate for estate tax purposes. But at the same time, we're still keeping the same property tax base in place for the children. So that's primarily what our focus is. And with that, does anybody have any questions regarding that?
Well, this is Tom Bacon, and John, it seems so simple. That's a lot of information, and I had a question. A client of mine bought a property, and he bought it as an individual. It was an exchange. He exchanged into the property, and now he's just seen your seminar, and he wants to turn that property into an LLC and set it up properly so he avoids reassessments and things like that. Am I safe to assume that you can't do that when it's a property that's an exchange because you can't change ownership, can you?
You typically you're not changing an ownership for over a year. Is the issue. You want to have some time going by. You may, if it's a single member LLC, it might be okay for that, that point. But typically with an exchange, because that's supposed to be for investment purposes, you're supposed to be doing that and not, not using it for investment purposes. So, so typically he would want to wait at least a year before he did that.
Okay. I think if people want to ask questions, they can raise their hand and or they can unmute and just ask a question. I'm not sure.
I have a question.
Okay.
John, thank you for the information. It is very technical, which makes me glad you're the lawyer and I am not. Can you talk me through, say I'm a property owner, can you talk me through what a conversation looks like for you when you're meeting a new prospect? How do you kind of do discovery to learn more about them, what they own and their goals to determine whether or not the kind of efforts you've just explained are worth even talking about? And the reason I ask is I think if you talk about it in that way, like who might be a good fit, who isn't, it might help me recognize opportunities to share this information with certain people while avoiding putting it on anyone's radar who wouldn't benefit from these strategies.
So part of it is you really kind of want to have a couple of things are in play. You want to have a feel for what their total assets are. So I think anytime you're giving anybody, advice like that, you're probably going to want to give some kind of a questionnaire, so that way you get a feel for what their total assets are. Maybe look at their tax returns, which will give you an idea of really what the total assets are. You might want to look at their estate plan if they have one. So that way you can see, where they're going to want assets to be going. And so then that will also alert you, first as to, what their long-term goals are going to be. You're going to want to look at the type of property that it is, where it's going and what their overall, as I say, their overall goals are. And I think that's really what it is. And even just talking to them is are they planning on keeping the property? Are they planning on selling the property? What are their long-term goals? And if it's somebody who's not keeping it for the long term, they're just buying it with the idea of selling it within a few years, maybe this is less of an issue. And I think this is more of an issue when you have property with the clients where you have a legacy property where they have, properties that they want to maintain. We had a client that had, $55 million worth of income producing properties. He didn't want to be selling it. He wanted to have that transferring down to his daughter, but then we also wanted to do that in a way so that way we could minimize the property tax. And so in there, we had a taxable estate. So we had a goal. So, going back through that sort of laundry list of steps that we took before, we weren't as concerned about basis. We were concerned about getting it out of his estate for estate tax purposes, but then setting it up so that way his daughter could enjoy the same low property tax base that he had. And so I think those are really what it is what are their goals with the property? What do they have? What is their estate plan? What's their total value? And just, are they planning on keeping the property for the long term or just selling it? And if it's somebody who's just going to be selling it, they have no desire, then less of an interest. But even still, when you think about it, acquiring it directly into the LLC, and as Tom was saying, it is such a simple choice, but it's just so often overlooked, when people do that. And if that has happened, you still have possibly a way of sort of saving that by transferring it and then just not, then going ahead and letting it, if the difference between acquiring it and the actual transfer into the LLC isn't too much time, there isn't much of an increase in value, and we're going to be keeping it for at least a generation or maybe more, then having it reassessed when we go there, then that avoids that taint, and it will be treated as if they had acquired it directly by the LLC. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey,
Hey, I got one Tom, real quick, sort
Yeah.
of related, but we do a lot of 1031 exchange and strategies on a real estate side. And I get requests on date of death valuations routinely. And I've heard varying opinions as far as whether that needs to be an MAI or a BOV is sufficient. Do you have any experience in that arena?
Well, it depends on the type of property. If it's a large valuable income producing property and they're going to be in a state tax return, then you're going to want to have a qualified appraiser to do that. If it's if it's residential property or something like that, then there's less of a concern for that. But if it is income producing commercial property, I think you're going to want to have a qualified appraiser do that.
Why do you say that? Is that from a compliance standpoint or just a perceived accuracy?
Just a risk tolerance and a cost. So if it's, I think there's less of a, I think there's more of a risk with the higher the value of the property, the more you're going to want to have the qualified appraiser. And then it's easier for, for getting a lower cost valuation. But even if you have the lower cost valuations, you're going to want to make sure that you have comparable sale information in that, if you're going that route. But if it's a residential property and it's a, lower cost, I think, the risk is a little bit lower. And technically there isn't anything that the IRS says that you can use, a lower thing, but a lower quality appraisal. But, when the value is lower and it's a residential property, and it's easier to get comparable sale information oftentimes, then I think you can get away with that. And I have advised my clients to do that from time to time.
What I've found is that if you have a spousal death and you're adjusting one side of the equation on the basis, when we've seen appraisers come in, they are a little more conservative on their value because you want to get that basis up as high as you can.
Correct.
Whereas when I look at it as a commercial developer and broker, even if my opinion of the cap rate is 0.25% different than what that conservative appraiser is, it could be pretty substantial difference right there. So when they're evaluated, have you seen where that BOV, if whoever has provided it, if the resume is pretty substantial, do they discount it or anything because it's not an MAI? Or
no, I mean, they're still working off of the valuation. I don't see that they do. Are you talking about the IRS or what have you?
Yeah, I think it's challenged.
They don't look at it that way. They're going to look at the quality of that. And, it is hard for the IRS to get a independent valuation, honestly. And so, so that's number one. But really what they're looking at is if we've complied with what the requirements are in the code or not. And I don't think that they look at it in terms of discounting it in that way at all. And you do have to be a little bit more careful because, when we have a taxable estate, even with a spouse, when you're taking portability, you have to file a portability return, for the surviving spouse, to preserve the estate tax. There is a estate tax exemption. There was a recent case where they were really looking for a full, normally we've looked at that where you didn't really feel like you had to do as much effort in terms of the valuation on the portability return. And there was a recent case where they got dinged pretty hard on that. So again, even when it's when it's a surviving spouse, I think you still want to make sure that we're getting good, strong numbers.
Got it. Thank you.
So John, this is probably a dumb question. I'm assuming that the best time to form an LLC is before you buy the property, right?
Well, normally what happens, yes. So you don't want to be able, because it has to be formed to close into it. So, you'll have a purchase agreement. Usually the purchase agreement will say an individual or an entity owned and controlled by that individual. And so they have the opportunity to do that. But yes, you have to have it formed for it to close into that. So you would be wanting to do that, certainly prior to closing.
Yeah. So then to unwind or to reestablish, to create an LLC after the fact, it just got to call you up and say, hey, I've got this.
Well,
situation.
then you have that whole issue with the taint. But if you do that right after, right, if it's the day, if it's like within a week or a short period of time after, maybe we don't care as much, because if it's reassessed, there's gonna be no difference, correct? And
Right.
so if you work through that, I think it's better to have it formed and done properly right at the very beginning. But if, let's say if somebody misses, I think the next step is, just go ahead and forming it, not, and the exemption isn't automatic. That 62A2 proportional interest exemption is not automatic. You have to advise them. And when you look at the code section for the reassessment, regarding that taint, it specifically says if it was acquired and transferred and there was a reassessment exclusion because of that proportional interest, then that taint applies. So it ties right back into the code. So I think you're really pretty safe by doing it pretty quickly after. It's not the best situation, but it's still, I think you're still safe, because there isn't, if there hasn't been enough time for any appreciable increase in value, I don't see how that they're going to really be affected by that. But it would still be reassessed.
Thanks. Yeah.
Well, I hope I didn't throw too many percentages and fractional interest into this. And it isn't a hugely complex thing, but as Tom was saying, it's simple, but it's something I've seen. I've just seen missed so many times. And even when somebody does it correctly, where they set it up so that the LLC has acquired it directly, but then not thinking about where it's going to go in their estate plan, can have a really dramatic effect. And so again, it's just, making sure you're being careful and thoughtful each and every step along the way.
That's great. Really appreciate the information, John. And boy, you could talk for hours about this subject and still be confused. But I've really gotten a lot out of it. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. I hope it was helpful.
Absolutely. And that email address up there, office manager, is the best way to get a hold of your office. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Beautiful. Anybody else have any questions? I'm sure there are a few out there, so I anticipate you'll get some emails there, John. So with that said,
Paul, I've got one. John.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was a fire hose, man, coming at me anyway. So to me, the takeaway, if I have a client that whose estate is leaving the house to their kids, and if any one of those kids are interested in buying the other siblings out to live in it themselves, we need to be in touch with someone like yourself first.
We need to think about that.
Is that a safe assumption?
Yeah, because that also could trigger a reassessment. That's correct.
Okay. But if they just want to inherit the house, they're all going to sell it, no big deal,
Correct.
right? Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hello, John. Can you hear me?
Gary, how are you? I haven't spoken with you in quite a few years.
I know what we need to catch up. So I have a client that could pull, and we can talk after this. But the family members, their green card, they're not U.S. citizens, but green card people that own the property. It happens to be in the Los Angeles area. But two of the children live offshore in another country, but have the green cards here. So they stay there and come back to keep the green cards. How would that affect a transfer? It's a substantial amount of property, of which much of it is in California. But how would that affect the concept?
That's something I would have to look at. My initial thought is I think, we're really not getting into, that's something I'd have to look at before I could just answer off the top of my head.
All right. Well, excellent presentation. If you get a chance, call me later today, or I'll give you a call. I'd love to catch up.
That would be great.
And I'm going to sign off right now. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice talking to you, Gary.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Super. Well, no other questions going once, going twice. Tom, appreciate you bringing John in. John, thank you very much for your time. That was a great presentation. I got a few pages of notes and I'll probably have some questions myself for you later when I assimilate it all. But appreciate you all showing up and have a great week. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.